Chief Warrant Officer Jonathan C. Hart was born February 20th, 1978. He was born in New Holland, Pennsylvania, and grew up with 6 siblings, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. One of his brothers, Sam, also served in the Marine Corps for 27 years. Hart grew up in a Mennonite church, which did not condone military service, but he chose to serve anyways. Hart's father was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, and he served in a military hospital, but chose not to be involved in combat. Both of his parents are proud of his military service. Hart went to Manheim Central High School in Manheim, Pennsylvania. He did not have any secondary education, but during his service, the military provided him with tuition assistance classes. Hart took those classes, but chose not to work towards a specific degree. Hart had a lot of jobs in his lifetime outside the military, including stainless steel welding, working for a tree service company, working at various farms, and also working on a cruise ship.
With our country, but when we actually went to war in 2003, I felt that it was my place to join the service and go in.
In 2003, when America went to war, Hart felt that it was his place to join the military to help out. His brother had already joined the military at that time. Hart enlisted in April of 2003 and went to boot camp in October of 2003. His recruiter took him to the processing center called MEPS in Harrisburg, and from there they went to the Harrisburg airport. He then flew to South Carolina, where he got processed at the airport and evaluated by medical specialists. After all that, they took a bus into Parris Island, South Carolina, where he met his drilling instructors. Hart went through basic training twice. The first time he went through basic training in April of 2003, they didn't have a spot open for the job he wanted. He wanted to be artillery, but the military didn't have a spot for him until October of 2003. When he took his hearing test, he barely failed it. Since he barely failed, he only spent 21 days in boot camp because he got what is called an erroneous entry. When he was at a county fair that year, a Marine recruiter saw him doing pull-ups and wanted Hart to join the Marines. The recruiter gave him waivers to join, and he later found out that one of the big reasons he got kicked out of the Marines was because they didn't want to waste their time on someone who they thought failed intentionally. He went through all of the paperwork again in March of 2005 and then went to boot camp for the second time. He spent 13 weeks on Parris Island in South Carolina. Hart's first assignment after basic training was in Okinawa, Japan. As his first job as a young PSD, he had a lot to learn at his first duty station, and from there was deployed to Iraq. Here he did non-lethal training, as well as training with the MUE and for search and rescue missions. He had more training in Korea and Australia following his time in Iraq. Hart also received specialized training, including specialized non-lethal training, riot control, ground control, and land ab. He started out as a utilities marine regarding refrigeration, even though Hart did not know this was going to be his first job. He thought he was going to start out as a combat engineer doing construction and demolition. He went through advanced courses for wiring and leadership. Eventually, he went to school for the Basic Warrant Officer course, which is the only one the Marine Corps had at the time. He had a lot of professional military education. As a Chief Warrant Officer, his duties included being in charge of a platoon. This was called being an SME, or subject matter expert. To be a warrant officer in the Marines, you do not need a college education. Instead, fitness reports written by the OIC or officer in charge were important when becoming a warrant officer. It was also important to have a variety of missions, including narrow wing missions, ground missions, and service support missions. The size of a warrant officer's platoon can vary from as little as 7 Marines to as many as 50 Marines or more. Warrant officers would look to the commander on how to best employ the Marines and their equipment. Hart was also an instructor during a part of his career in the military. He was deployed with reserves, and this was one of his favorite duty stations from his career. They were deployed to Al-Assad, Iraq, to set up a radar center, LSA, or life support area. Part of their job was to provide the utilities and logistics to get the camp running efficiently.
Puerto Rico was probably my favorite mission, specific mission, if you will. It was a humanitarian mission. It was after Hurricane Maria, which is not a great thing to have as a need, but it is a reality of life, and that we're going to have those. And it's awesome that our military devotes the time to support people who've been through a natural disaster like that.
Being one of his favorite missions, Hart was a part of the Puerto Rico humanitarian mission that was launched after Hurricane Maria. The military devoted their time to help the Puerto Ricans through their time of need due to this natural disaster. Since training can feel useless or pointless, he appreciated the purpose behind what they did in Puerto Rico. The Marines' primary mission in Puerto Rico was to provide water for the Ospreys, which are planes used in the military to wash their engines. This water was also used to create a life support area in Puerto Rico. Having only seen pictures from before Hurricane Maria, Jonathan and his Marines did not know what to expect. Things looked completely different after being wiped out by the hurricane. Once they arrived, their mission was to create an Osprey base for them to live and provide them with usable water that they could wash their engines with. Though civilians could have used this water for drinking, washing the Osprey's engine was a priority because they were bringing food and medical supplies to the rest of the island. Washing the engines was a part of the Osprey's maintenance. The equipment they used had to be set up in the ocean. The ocean in this area was very rough, and therefore they lost some equipment. Once the equipment was set up, they were able to make enough water for the Ospreys and more. This extra water went to the local Air National Guard as well as a Coast Guard base, a nearby Army unit, and the close-by community.
Throughout his military career, Hart had many instructors. One particular instructor that stood out to him was Sergeant Grulich from MOS School, with whom he later went to Australia with. Sergeant Grulich later became a Chief Warrant Officer, and as a mentor to Hart, encouraged him to become a Chief Warrant Officer as well. Hart's older brother also became a Chief Warrant Officer, which pushed him to strive to become a Chief Warrant Officer too. As a Marine, Hart qualified at boot camp with his service rifle and then proceeded to Marine combat training, where he received more training on weapon systems and machine guns. He later went on to have licenses in Humvees, as well as training in heavy equipment and other equipment in the Marines. This involved learning the ranges and safety of the equipment, as well as plotting courses. According to Hart, one of the hardest parts of training was waiting. A common motto he heard throughout his service was "hurry up and wait." Throughout his career in the Marines, Hart received regular promotions and was promoted notoriously a few times. He did well on things such as fitness reports, physical training scores, and educational scores. Hart served in many locations throughout his service time. He started in South Carolina for boot camp and from there went to North Carolina for MCT. He was then stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and went to California. After that, he was moved to Virginia and then went back to California. Following that, he went to both North and South Carolina. In parts of his career, he also served in Puerto Rico, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Australia, and Korea. This provided many new experiences for Jonathan as a Marine and allowed him to see different cultures around the world. His first deployment was combat support, while the second deployment was mostly combat service support. Hart's entire career was centered around support in some way. His role in Operation Iraqi Freedom was primarily support. Many of Hart's friendships in the military were mutual respect relationships. He is still in contact with 2 fellow Marines from his time in service. Hart was medically retired from the Marine Corps after 14 years of being a Chief Warrant Officer. While in the service, Hart was able to stay in contact with his friends and family through phone calls or emails. Due to being stationed in established bases, he did not have to go more than a month without being in contact with his family at home. While he was off duty, Hart often did physical training or worked out, but also enjoyed playing cards. He also had access to a computer during both his deployments and also participated in poker with fellow Marines. After his career in the military, Hart moved back to Schuylkill County with his family and has since gone back to work. He was a member of the DVA, a veteran organization, but has moved to the American Legion. Throughout his career, he earned various medals and awards for recognition and more. Being in the Marines helped Hart to learn more about the real world and how you don't always know why something happened, but there's a reason and you just have to go with it, which can be applied to civilian life as well as life in the military. Hart did a lot throughout his 14 years of service in the Marines. From serving as inspector instructor and humanitarian to becoming Chief Warrant Officer, he experienced many different parts of the Marines. After his service, Hart returned to Pennsylvania and lives with his family there. He returned to working after the Marines and continues to do so. Thank you for your service to our country.